How about we add some chips to that model? When I'm planning on adding chips to a model, the first thing I do with regards to that is just kind of think about the plan of chipping that I want to take. And that may involve looking at real-world photos, if there's examples of the real thing, or if it's something in the science fiction realm, are there examples in media that I can look at of that? If not, I find something that may be similar that's going to have chipping that I can look at and help me understand better how to chip the model. I also think in terms of how heavy do I want it? What am I trying to accomplish with that so that later steps can take advantage of that chipping? For example, am I wanting to add a lot of rust stains? Well, if so, then that's going to affect how I approach my chipping, because rust is going to come from where those chips are. So having a plan in place, even if it's just a real basic one, I know I want to chip it heavily and I know I want it to be rusty. That's a plan. That's good enough. Now, of course, once you have that plan in place, you're going to want to pick some chipping colors. Now, I did a whole video on this, so after this video, you may want to go check that one out. But in general, you're going to need to make some determinations about how many layers of chipping are you going to do. Are there just going to be some lighter surface scratches? Is it going to go down to a primer layer? Is there going to be an underlying material that you want to show? If you have a 2-color camouflage scheme, or 3 colors, or whatever the number is, how were those applied on, if you're imagining the model as a real thing, how were those applied? Were they applied over the base color, or were they done as 2 separate colors? All of that is going to affect the chipping colors that you have. So think in terms of that when you're picking your chipping colors. Generally, a safe route to go is to pick a lighter color of your base and then a darker color representing the underlying material. Now, something I think about when I'm planning my chipping is scale. It can vary, of course, as varied as there are scales, but I generally try to think in terms of how big is a man next to this vehicle, next to whatever it is that I'm going to be chipping. And then I think in terms of real world, what's realistic? Yeah, you're going to see some pieces of chips on any kind of real world object that may be really big, this big relatively, or even bigger depending on what you're looking at, say like a ship. That may have some very large areas of chipping on it. But generally, when you're talking about tanks and armor and mobile suits and things like that, most chips aren't really going to be much bigger than your hand. And so I try to think in terms of, generally, in scale, the largest chips are not going to be any bigger than a person's hand. Maybe you have some that's as big as your head, and if you got a big old head like me, that may be some very large chips. But then a lot of the chips are just going to be smaller, some just barely visible on the model. But the more you think about the scale of the chipping, regardless of the quantity of chips that you're going to put in, but the more you think about the scale, the more that it's going to lend to the credibility and realism of your final finish. Adding chips to scale models really does a lot of things for us. One, it just gives them a feel of realism. We see objects in the real world. We see vehicles, in a construction yard, or maybe we have an older car or a building that, we see that has had some of the plaster chipped away on the outside of it. Something like that. We see that in the real world. So adding chipping to a scale model helps give it a sense of realism, but it also sort of gives it a sense of weight. The more we're aware, even on a subconscious level, of the fact that this thing is supposed to be made of steel or iron or some kind of other heavy material like that, the more it gives it a bit of a heaviness, and the more it sells to our brains that, hey, this is kind of a real object. That's what we're going for, is in the chipping and in the other finishing techniques we do, is that sense of realism. And of course, it can also act a little bit as edge highlighting. It helps bring out the shapes on the model that might not otherwise be perceived at a normal viewing distance. So chipping done strategically can help highlight the shapes and features of the model. And then, of course, I think the final reason that always drives me is I just have a lot of fun chipping. I think it's one of the most fun things that I do in the whole process of building a model. And so I get caught up quite often in chipping. I have trouble restraining myself when it comes to chipping, but it's just a fun thing to do. Now, what I want to do in this video is just some basic demonstrations of applying chipping to your models. I'm not really going to be focusing on multiple color schemes and more complicated levels of chipping. I'll save those for later episodes in this series. But what I want to focus on in this video is just basic application of chips, looking at some very common techniques and kind of showing how to apply those, some factors to think about when you're doing it, and hopefully, whether you've never chipped before and it's very informative for you, or maybe if you've been chipping for quite a while but you pick up something that may be helpful, I hope there's something here for everybody. The first type of chipping that we're going to be looking at is sponge chipping. First, you're going to need a piece of sponge. I like to use this sponge that comes from packing foam. We get this in shipments of fruit and sometimes chocolates and things like that that we get from a company called Harry and David. It's a very tight, dense foam pattern. I like this better than most other foams, sponges, whatever you want to call them. You could use the sponges, the dry sponges from the kitchen sink or anything else, but you're just basically looking for something that's porous and has a little bit of a pattern to it. It's generally best to have something to hold the sponge with. I like to use clamps like this. You could use tweezers. You can just use your fingers. You'll need a piece of paper towel or something to dab off some of the paint on. You'll, of course, need your paint that you're going to use. In this case, I'm going to be using this German Camo Black-Brown, mainly for contrast reasons for the demonstration. This is probably not the paint that I would pick for my first round of chipping if this were a live model, I guess you'd say. But for the sake of demonstration, this will give good contrast. And then, of course, you need the star of the show, the part that you're going to be chipping. I clamp the sponge in my tweezers like this, and then I like to just cut off the corners of the sponge. That just reduces the surface area that's going to be in primary contact and just gives me a little bit more control. Preparing the paint is fairly simple. First, I get a little bit of paint in whatever palette that I'm going to be using. I don't tend to use a wet palette for this because often a wet palette will get my paint too wet, so I go with this dry palette. To that, I'll add just a drop of water. I usually thin my paint in about a 1-to-1 ratio of paint and water. I start by dipping just the end of the sponge into the paint. I don't dig it in there real deep so that it gets soaked. And then I just start sponging off onto my paper towel until I get it looking like chipping, basically. And then I just start applying it to the model. Of course, I'm looking for areas where chipping would happen. And so I look at corners and edges and places like that. Now, by having my paint a little thinner, it allows me to build it up much more slowly and get an overall pattern that looks like something that's been out and in combat and roughed up a bit. If you leave your paint a little thicker, then you can develop bigger areas of chips. Like down here along the feet, you may want bigger areas of chips, but be aware that the thicker your paint is, the greater the chance that it's going to leave some texture on the model. So you want to be aware of that. But you see, I just dab in and dab out. I come right back out. It's a touch the model, come back off. And the more pressure you put, the more of a pattern you're going to leave. So here, let me do just a light touch and you can see that. But then if I push really hard, you see it leaves more paint. And my indicator that I need more paint is when none is coming off the sponge. It's a real easy method. I think this is probably the most approachable method. If you've never done chipping before, this is probably the most approachable method to start with. While I'm just getting started on this piece, you can see that it does a fairly reasonable job of making it look very chipped and worn down. Sponge chipping is a great way to get started into chipping if you've never done that before. But there's also another simple method that may be something you've done before but never thought of it as a type of chipping, and that's dry brushing. Sometimes I like to use dry brushing for chipping. It's a very easy and quick method, and often I'll use a flat brush like the one on the right, or the more fluffy dry brush that you can use like a makeup brush. This one is actually from the Army Painter. It's a purpose-made dry brush. Either one will work. They just allow you to impart some very discrete color in very precise places. It's a little more of a precision tool than doing the sponge chipping. Now, in addition to the brushes, of course, you'll need your paint, and I'm going to stick with that German camo brown, and also a piece of paper towel. Now for this, I don't thin the paint. I go with it right out of the bottle because dry brushing generally works best with thicker paint. But I work most of the paint off onto this paper towel, and then I just grab the part and I start dry brushing along the edge. Now, the motion is exactly like traditional dry brushing. There's no difference to it. But because of the placement and the color, it's going to appear as chipping rather than just dry brushing. And you can see how this can make very fine edge chipping along an area. This can be used to develop initial areas of chipping that you'll later go back and make larger areas along there, or it can be used as your sole type of chipping on a model that you may not want to have quite as chipped. It's also a great way to get into areas that other methods like sponge chipping may not be able to reach as well. Now, if I want to add a little bit of a heavier chipping using this method, I just don't get as much paint off of the brush. And then when I go in, I can use the edge of the brush and impart more paint onto the model and just make it look like it's more heavily chipped. This is less of a dry brush motion that I'm doing and more of just a very light painting motion, I guess you'd say. But you can see, there's a good example right there. You can see how along edges that makes additional chipping that's just a little bit heavier. Now, using the same brush, I can go in and I can just apply it to an edge like that and let the brush push in more color. So just by changing the motion of how I apply the paint, I can get a much heavier chipped look. And if I want to apply the paint on a more open surface to get a streak or something like that, I can use the end of the brush to do that. Sponge chipping and dry brushing can give you a great look, but they're kind of big brush applications in that they're not always as precise as you'd like them to be in some situations. So when you're really wanting more precision chipping, brush chipping is the way to go. For brush chipping, I like to use a very small, fine brush. This is a 3-0 brush from Da Vinci. This is a synthetic, but I've used synthetics and natural hair brushes, and I find that for my purposes, they tend to work equally well. Of course, we'll go with the same paint that we have, and I'll use a piece of paper towel. For the paint, I thin it a little bit more than I do for any of the other techniques that I've shown so far. Maybe about 2 parts water, 1 part paint. It can vary between paints, but as you get experience doing it, you'll find what works best for you and your technique. Application is fairly straightforward. I dip my brush into the paint, and then I like to wick off just a little bit of that excess. And then on edges and things like that, I just use the edge of the brush to begin going in and just lightly skimming along, adding some color to that edge to begin the chipping. And then occasionally I let the brush dance out onto the surface. This really is a bit of a shaky hand technique. I actually like doing it because my hands tend to shake, and so I find this a little easier. Now, it can be frustrating at first. I find that not everyone, but most people, myself included, the first time you try brush chipping, it comes out a little heavy-handed because you have to develop through repetition a very light touch for what you're doing, which gives you more control. So don't be surprised if the first time you try this, if it's a little heavy. That may indicate that you're using a brush that's a little too big or that doesn't have a fine enough point. It's not so much using a tiny brush that's important, but one that has a very good point. But you can see how that's developed some chipping right there. Now, this method is also extremely good if you want to develop chipping on open surfaces, but keep it fairly restrained. You can make streaks like this to look like scuffs. You can just dot in some places, just stipple in some areas where you want chipping to be. You can make areas of larger chips. Notice I didn't dab it off this time. I left more paint on the brush. And so I can build a very large chip right there, but I'm still just stippling that on. Now I tend to grip the brush real close to the bristles. A lot of folks like to use it further back and let the natural bounce that comes in from using it, from holding it further back, develop some of the chips. Because my hand tends to shake quite a bit, I don't do that. I get enough hand shake as it is without having to hold the brush further back. But this method allows you to really customize the chips, get them everywhere you want, and allows for some very fine chips. It does take longer than the other methods, but you really get to put them exactly where you want them. One note, while you're doing this, you're going to want to occasionally dip your brush over in some cleaner or some thinner or just some plain water and occasionally clean it, because the paint will dry on the tip of the brush. And so by just cleaning it off every now and then in a cup of water, that's what I've got, a cup of warm water, I can just clean that off and then go right back to work, and any of the paint that has dried up on the tip will have been removed. The final method that I'm going to demonstrate is what's often called hairspray chipping, or making use of chipping fluid. For this demonstration, I'll use hairspray just because it's my preference, but I've used both commercial chipping fluid and hairspray, and they work equally well. The main thing is it gives a very realistic chipping pattern. Now, I just used some fairly cheap Aquanet hairspray. The brand is not so much important as just using plain hairspray with not a lot of additives to it. And then I spray it on the model just in fairly wet but single pass coats, making sure to get all the sides of it. And then once I've got it coated, I set it aside and let that dry. It takes about 10 minutes. And then after it's dry, I give it another coat, just like I did before, so that it's got plenty of chipping fluid on it. And again, set that aside and let it dry for just a little while. Now, it'll take a little while for the hairspray or the chipping fluid, depending on what you're using, to dry. It may look a little lumpy and bumpy, but that's okay. What you're looking for is for any of the drops and the bumpy areas to no longer be gloss. Once they're not glossy, they're dry. And you can use a hair dryer or something like that to speed up the drying process. You don't want to do it too hard. You don't want to get it too firmly set in place, but you can speed up the process a little bit. Now, for the paint, I'm not doing anything exotic. I'll just be using some plain Tamiya paint, and to me is X20A thinner. I've done this with water-based acrylics. I've done this with lacquers. The key in terms of putting the paint over the chipping fluid or hairspray is you don't want to flood the surface. You don't want a very thick coat of paint. You want it to be just enough to get to the opacity that you're looking for, and it'll make the chipping much easier. More chipping fluid means more chips. Thicker paint means less chips. You have to kind of balance that out. I don't do anything special when I'm putting on the paint. I just apply it in light passes like I normally would. But the main thing I'm going to do is go for full opacity and then stop. I don't apply a lot of coats of paint, just enough to bring it up to full opacity. That's the stopping point. Now the chipping process is fairly simple. You just need some plain old tap water. I like to keep a paper towel handy, so if there's any paint that collects on the surface, I can wick it off and wipe it away. And then I just like using an angled shader brush like this, but you can try different brushes because different people prefer different methods in terms of brushes. But I just dip my brush in the water, wick a little bit of it off, and just wipe the paint or wipe the water over the surface that I want to chip. And that starts activating the chipping fluid or the hairspray underneath. Now you have to be careful, because if you just suddenly go into it real hard, you may produce a really big chip initially that you don't want. So what I recommend is being a little more gentle and starting along the edges and just working it like this. It may take anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes, but eventually the paint will start coming up and you'll get some nice edge chipping. See how that's starting to develop right there? And then how vigorously you proceed from here is completely up to you and how much chipping you want to do. You can hit at it pretty hard and start getting some fairly dramatic chips. You can be much more petite about your motions and get smaller chips. You can pretty much wipe the paint away if you wanted to. But it all depends on how much water you apply, how vigorous you are with your motions, how thick your chipping fluid was, how thick your paint layer is. All of those things are going to produce different results. So it will take some experimentation in order to get the result that you're looking for. You can also use a toothpick and just come in with that. And if you want to make various scratches along the surface, it's great for that. And the question often comes up, how long after putting on the chipping fluid do I have to get all of this done? I've heard folks say that you have to do it within just 10 or 15 minutes. I've heard others say you can do it several hours later. The way I do it is I make sure that whenever I'm going to do hairspray chipping is that I have enough time set aside so that I can put the hairspray on, I can let it dry, I can then airbrush on the paint that I want, let it dry, and then have enough time to do the chipping process. I don't know the amount of time it takes for the chipping fluid to stop being active. It can vary between brands and the application that you have over it in terms of paint and things like that. What I recommend is once you put the chipping fluid on and the paint and you've got your chipping the way you want it, that once the paint is fully dry, that you seal it with an appropriate clear coat. I usually do a satin clear coat, so then I can put further weathering effects and other effects over it and not worry about reactivating the chipping fluid. I think the main takeaway is, regardless of which chipping method you prefer, using more than one is going to be the most successful on models. I've found it that way for the work that I do. For example, I may do sponge chipping just to develop the initial layer of chips to kind of map out where are the bigger areas of chipping, the lighter areas of chipping, to just sort of set the chipping pattern across the model. And then I'll go in with a brush and I'll add in more fine chips. I'll develop chips that have already started through the sponging method. I'll add in some some streaks and scrapes and other areas that are done better with a brush. And then I generally go for a 2-color chipping scheme. So there's the lighter color that's going to represent the surface scratches on the paint. And then there's going to be a darker color, which may represent primer or may represent the base material. But combining colors and combining techniques, I think, is going to give the best result. Now, another thing to remember is that each of these requires practice. While none of them are very difficult in and of themselves, as with most things in this hobby, the first time you do it, it may not turn out like you want. So be aware of that. Don't let that frustrate you. And then, of course, if you do find that there's just one method that you're just hitting your head against the wall. I've had a few friends that said they've tried hairspray chipping many times and they make it work. They just don't like the way it looks. So whether it's sponging or brush chipping or whatever, hairspray chipping, if there's one of these methods that you try and you go, you know, I just don't like it, that's okay too. Not every method is for everybody. Remember, the key point of all of this is to have fun while you're chipping your model. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I know it's been a fairly basic video in terms of the methods that I've demonstrated, but hopefully if you're new to chipping, if you haven't tried it, it'll be helpful to you to figure out some ways that you might add chipping to your models. And even if you're a more experienced modeler, maybe it's given you some ideas, sparked some ideas that will help you further the chipping that you're already doing. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the very end. Here's a bonus tip. Mechanical pencils are great for very fine, very precise chipping. You can get in and make some really fine marks. Now they're going to be a little metallic looking, so you probably want to follow up with a matte coat so that they don't look shiny. Now if you do want them to look shiny, you can leave them as is. This can be removed with enamel odorless thinner, so be aware of that. If you're going to start using enamel odorless thinner for any weathering applications after this, you're going to want to seal this in with some kind of clear coat. My recommendation would be a satin clear coat, but you do whatever is appropriate for the model that you're working on. Another great method is to use these pencils. This is some of the pencils from AK, and it's called chipping color, but these work great also for very precise, very fine chips, and they're really quick to use. So keep this in mind too. This works best over a flat or a satin finish. If you try and do it over gloss, it doesn't work as well. This stuff can be removed and smeared with water and other things, so again, you may want to seal this in before applying anything else over it. Thanks so much for watching to the very end. I hope you've liked this bonus tip. Well, if you've not already done so, please click the subscribe button down over here and hit the little bell icon so you'll know when I have new videos come out. And also, I'd be very grateful if you would leave this video a like and drop a comment down below. It just helps me grow the channel, which is something I'm trying to do. There's also links down below to Patreon. If you would like to support the work that I do, you can click on that and see the options that are available for supporters. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much. What you do makes this possible, because otherwise I simply wouldn't be able to afford to do the work that I do at the pace that I do with the materials that I do on our current budget. So it's not only a blessing to me, it's a blessing to my family. Thank you very much. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.